She was 12 years old, wearing a dress with a frayed hem, standing in a room full of billionaires who laughed when she named her price. But when she opened her mouth and spoke a language none of them expected, the entire room went silent. This is the story of a little girl who refused to be small, and the billionaire who finally learned what money can't buy. There are moments in life that arrive quietly. No dramatic music. No warning signs. Just the soft crackle of static from an old radio and a little girl sitting cross-legged on a worn carpet, listening to voices in a language most people would never understand. Her name was Lena Moore. She was 12 years old. And tonight, she was listening to Dutch. The apartment was small. The kind of small where you could hear everything. Your mother's breathing from the next room, the hum of the refrigerator that only worked half the time, the drip of the kitchen faucet that no one had the money to fix. The walls were thin enough that Lena could hear the couple upstairs arguing, their voices muffled but sharp, like distant thunder. But Lena didn't focus on any of that. She focused on the radio. It was old, heavy, the kind of device that belonged in a different era, with dials that clicked and a speaker that buzzed when the signal wasn't clear. But it had been her father's. And when he died 3 years ago, it was one of the only things he left behind. Not money. Not a house. Not a savings account or a life insurance policy. Just languages. Her father, Daniel Moore, had been a multilingual interpreter. The kind of man who could walk into a room of strangers speaking 5 different languages and make them all feel understood. He had worked for international firms, embassies, corporate summits, anywhere words mattered and bridges needed to be built. He used to say, "Lena, money comes and goes. But what you know, what you carry in your mind, no one can ever take that from you." He taught her Dutch first, then French, then bits of German and Spanish. Every night after dinner, they would sit together, and he would play recordings, read her stories, make her repeat phrases until her accent was flawless. "Why do I need to learn all this?" she'd asked him once, frustrated after stumbling over a Dutch verb conjugation. He'd smiled. That calm, patient smile that made everything feel safe. "Because one day, you'll need to know your worth. And the world won't hand it to you, Lena. You'll have to claim it yourself." She didn't understand what he meant back then. But tonight, sitting alone in that cold apartment with the rain tapping against the window, she was beginning to. From the other room, Lena heard her mother's voice. It was strained, tight, the way it always sounded when she was trying not to cry. "Please," Helen Moore was saying into the phone. "I just need 1 more week. I promise I'll have it. Please." Lena's stomach twisted. She knew that tone. She'd heard it before. When the electricity bill came late. When the school asked for fees they couldn't afford. When the medical bills from her father's final days kept arriving in the mail, months and months after he was gone. "I understand," her mother said quietly. "I know it's overdue. I know. But if you could just—" There was a long pause. Then her mother's voice cracked. $600. "I know. I'll get it. I promise." The call ended. Lena sat frozen, staring at the radio but no longer hearing it. $600. That was the number standing between them and eviction. Between having a roof over their heads and living out of their car. Between surviving and falling apart. Her mother walked into the room a moment later. Helen Moore was a thin woman, worn down by years of working 2 jobs and still never having enough. She worked as a low-level assistant at a translation firm. Ironic, considering her late husband had been a translator. But she didn't have his gift for languages. She had his work ethic, his kindness, his quiet strength, but not his skills. She tried to smile when she saw Lena. "Hey, sweetheart. Still listening to that old thing?" Lena nodded. Helen sat down beside her, resting a hand on Lena's shoulder. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, mother and daughter, listening to the rain. "We're going to be okay," Helen finally whispered. But Lena heard the doubt in her voice. The call came 2 hours later. Helen's phone rang, and she answered it with the tired professionalism she always used for work. "Hello? Yes, this is Helen Moore." Lena watched her mother's face shift, from exhaustion to confusion to panic. Now? But it's almost 9 o'clock. Yes. Yes, I understand. The Grandview Hotel. I'll be there in 20 minutes. She hung up and immediately started moving, grabbing her coat, her bag, searching for her keys. What's wrong? Lena asked. Work emergency, Helen said, her hands shaking slightly as she buttoned her coat. There's a big summit happening tonight at the Grandview, some kind of international business negotiation. My boss needs me to deliver documents. Apparently the courier service messed up and God, I don't have time to explain. I have to go. I'm coming with you, Lena said, standing up. Lena, no. It's late and… Mom. Lena's voice was calm, steady. I'm coming with you. Helen looked at her daughter. 12 years old. Too young to be this serious. Too young to have that look in her eyes. The look that said she'd already seen too much, understood too much, carried too much. But there wasn't time to argue. Fine. But stay close to me. Don't wander off. They grabbed their coats and rushed out into the rain. The Grandview Hotel was everything their apartment wasn't. Warm. Bright. Expensive. The lobby was massive, with marble floors that gleamed under chandeliers that looked like they cost more than Lena's entire life. Men in tailored suits and women in elegant dresses moved through the space like they owned it, speaking in low, confident voices. Lena felt small, out of place, like she was trespassing in a world that didn't want her. Her mother hurried to the front desk, spoke quickly with someone, and was directed toward a set of conference rooms on the second floor. Lena followed close behind, her worn sneakers squeaking softly against the polished floor. They took the elevator up. The doors opened onto a long hallway lined with doors. At the far end, Lena could hear voices, lots of them. Tense. Urgent. Helen knocked on one of the doors. A man in a sharp black suit opened it, took the envelope she handed him without a word, and closed the door again. That's it? Lena asked. Helen nodded, already turning to leave. That's it. Let's go. But as they walked back toward the elevator, the door behind them suddenly burst open. A woman in a pencil skirt and glasses rushed out, her face pale. Does anyone here speak Dutch? She called out desperately. We need a Dutch interpreter. Now. Helen stopped. Turned. What's wrong? The woman looked frantic. We have an investor from the Netherlands refusing to proceed without a translator. Our interpreter just got rushed to the hospital. Heart attack. We're in the middle of an $80 million deal, and if we don't find someone who speaks Dutch in the next 10 minutes, this entire negotiation falls apart. Helen's face went white. I don't speak Dutch. I'm sorry. The woman's shoulder sagged. She looked like she might cry. And that's when Lena spoke. I do. Both women turned to stare at her. What? Helen whispered. Lena looked up at her mother, then at the woman in the glasses. Her heart was pounding, but her voice stayed calm. I speak Dutch. The woman blinked. You're a child. I'm 12, Lena said. And I speak fluent Dutch. My father taught me. For a moment, no one moved. Then the woman grabbed Lena's hand. Come with me. Now. The conference room was chaos. 20 people, maybe more, all standing, talking over each other, gesturing wildly. At the center of it all was a tall man with graying hair and a thick Dutch accent, shouting something that no one seemed to understand. And at the head of the table sat a man Lena recognized instantly. Edward Cross. She'd seen his face on magazine covers at the grocery store checkout. Billionaire. CEO of Cross Global Industries. One of the richest men in Canada. He looked furious. The woman led Lena to the front of the room and cleared her throat loudly. Everyone, please. I found someone who speaks Dutch. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Lena, a 12-year-old girl in a simple dress with a frayed hem, standing in a room full of billionaires. Edward Cross's eyes narrowed. He leaned back in his chair, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. You've got to be kidding me. The Dutch investor turned, saw Lena, and frowned. Cross laughed. Actually laughed. This is your solution? A child. The woman stammered. She says she speaks Dutch. Oh, I'm sure she does, Cross said mockingly. He stood up, towering over Lena, his voice dripping with condescension. Tell me, little girl, do you even know what we're negotiating here? Lena looked up at him. Her hands were shaking, but she kept them still at her sides. No, she said honestly, but I know Dutch. Someone in the room snickered. Cross crossed his arms. And what exactly do you want for this service? Lena thought of her mother. The phone call. The landlord's voice. $600. The room erupted in laughter. Cross's smile widened. $600? Do you even know who I am? I spend more than that on lunch. Lena didn't flinch. That's my price, she said quietly. I speak Dutch. For a moment, Edward Cross just stared at her. Then he glanced at the Dutch investor, who was watching with growing curiosity, and back at Lena. Fine, Cross said, waving a dismissive hand. If you can actually do this, you'll get your $600. But when you fail, and you will, I want you out of here. Understood? Lena nodded. The Dutch investor said something in rapid Dutch. A test. And without hesitation, Lena responded. Perfectly. Fluently. The investor's eyebrows shot up. The room went completely silent. Cross's smile disappeared. And somewhere, in the back of Lena's mind, she heard her father's voice. Know your worth, Lena. And never let anyone take it from you. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. There's a kind of silence that feels like gravity. It doesn't just quiet a room. It pulls everything down into itself. Every breath, every heartbeat, every doubt. That's what filled the conference room the moment Lena Moore spoke Dutch. Not broken Dutch. Not textbook Dutch. Not the kind of Dutch you learn from an app or a weekend course. Fluent Dutch. Native-level Dutch. The kind that makes people forget, just for a second, that they're listening to a 12-year-old girl in a dress with a frayed hem. The Dutch investor, Henrik van der Berg, stared at her. His expression had shifted from skepticism to something else entirely. Surprise, yes, but also a flicker of respect. He said something else in Dutch, longer this time, more complex. A full sentence with legal terminology embedded in it, the kind of phrase designed to trip up amateurs. Lena didn't hesitate. She translated it into English, cleanly and precisely, her voice steady despite the fact that every single person in that room was now staring at her like she'd just performed a magic trick. Mr. Vanderberg is asking whether the liability clause in Section 12 covers incidents that occur during the transportation phase, or only during the operational phase after delivery. One of the lawyers at the table, a woman with sharp eyes and an expensive suit, flipped through a document and nodded slowly. She's right. That's exactly what he's asking. Edward Cross hadn't moved. He was still standing near the head of the table, arms crossed, jaw tight. But the mocking smile was gone. In its place was something harder to read, disbelief mixed with something that looked almost like irritation. Henrik spoke again, this time directing his words to the entire room through Lena. She listened carefully, her eyes focused, her mind working faster than her racing heart. He says he needs clarification on the energy output guarantees in the third quarter, and he wants to know if the maintenance contracts include on-site engineers, or if his company will need to provide their own technical staff. The CEO of the Canadian energy firm at the table jumped in immediately, speaking quickly. Lena turned to Henrik and translated. Back and forth. English to Dutch. Dutch to English. Minutes passed. Then 10 minutes. Then 20. The tension in the room began to shift. It wasn't chaos anymore. It was negotiation. Real negotiation. Clauses were discussed. Numbers were adjusted. Legal terms were clarified. And at the center of it all was a little girl who spoke two languages like they were both her native tongue. No one was laughing now. Lena's legs were starting to ache. She'd been standing for nearly an hour, translating without a break, her mind moving constantly between two languages. But she didn't sit down. She didn't ask for water. She didn't let her voice waver. Because she knew, somewhere deep in her bones, that the moment she showed weakness, the moment she hesitated, someone in this room would use it against her. Her father had taught her that too. In rooms like these, he'd told her once, People are always looking for a reason to dismiss you. Don't give them one. So she didn't. Henrik said something about tax structures. Lena translated. The Canadian lawyer responded with a counterproposal. Lena translated. A question about liability insurance. Another about currency exchange rates. Another about environmental impact assessments. She didn't miss a word. At one point, Henrik paused and looked directly at her. He said something in Dutch, and this time, there was warmth in his voice. Almost grandfatherly. Lena allowed herself a small smile as she translated. Mr. Vanderberg says he's impressed. He says my Dutch is better than most of the interpreters he's worked with. Someone at the table, a younger executive with a perfectly trimmed beard, let out a low whistle. Where did you learn to speak like that? Lena hesitated. For the first time all night, her voice softened. My father taught me. Is he a translator? He was, Lena said quietly. He passed away 3 years ago. The room fell silent again. But this time, it wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of respect. Even Edward Cross, still standing near the head of the table with his arms crossed, seemed to pause. Something flickered across his face, too quick to name, too buried to fully surface. Henrik said something else in Dutch. Lena translated, and the negotiation continued. It was almost midnight when they finally reached an agreement. $80 million. Contract signed. Handshakes exchanged. The Dutch investor stood, shook hands with the Canadian CEO, and then turned to Lena. He said something in Dutch, his voice kind, and reached out to shake her hand. Lena translated for the room, even though the words were meant for her. He says, thank you. He says I saved this deal, and that my father would be very proud. Her throat tightened. She shook his hand, and for just a second, she let herself feel it, the weight of what she'd just done. Not just the translation. Not just the deal. The fact that she'd stood in a room full of people who tried to make her feel small, and she hadn't let them. Henrik smiled, nodded to the room, and left with his assistant. The other executives began packing up their things, murmuring to each other, glancing at Lena with expressions that ranged from admiration to disbelief. And then Edward Cross stepped forward. He walked slowly, deliberately, his expensive shoes clicking against the polished floor. He stopped directly in front of Lena, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a checkbook. The room went quiet again. Cross clicked open a pen, scribbled something on the check, tore it out, and held it in front of Lena. $6,000, he said. His voice was calm, controlled. But there was something underneath it, something almost like a challenge. 10 times what you asked for. You earned it. Lena stared at the check. $6,000. That was enough to pay rent for months. Enough to fix the refrigerator. Enough to buy her mother a winter coat that wasn't falling apart. Enough to breathe. Her hand started to reach for it. And then she stopped. She looked up at Edward Cross. Really looked at him. At the expensive suit. The watch that probably cost more than her entire apartment. The way he stood, like the world bent around him, like he'd never once in his life been told no. And she thought about her father. About the way he used to sit with her at the kitchen table, teaching her verb conjugations and pronunciation, never rushing, never losing patience. Know your worth, Lena, he'd said. Not what someone else decides you're worth. What you decide. She'd asked for $600. Not because it was all she was worth, but because it was what she needed. What was fair. What was true. Lena took a breath. And then, in a voice that didn't shake, she said, no thank you. Edward Cross blinked. What? I asked for $600, Lena said. That's what I'll take. The room was frozen. Cross stared at her like she'd just spoken a language even he didn't understand. You're turning down $6,000? I'm accepting what I asked for, Lena said calmly. 600. That's the price I named. That's what's fair. For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. And then something extraordinary happened. Edward Cross, billionaire, CEO, man who could buy and sell entire companies before breakfast, laughed. But it wasn't the cruel, mocking laugh from before. It was something else. Quieter. almost genuine. He shook his head slowly, folded the check, and put it back in his pocket. Then he pulled out his wallet, counted out 6 crisp $100 bills, and placed them in Lena's hand. "You know what, kid?" he said, his voice lower now, almost thoughtful. "In 40 years of business, I've met a lot of people. Smart people. Ruthless people. People who'd do anything for money." He paused. "But I've never met anyone who turned down 10 times what they asked for, because they believed in the price they named." Lena closed her fingers around the bills. "My father taught me that your word matters. If I say something costs 600 and then I take 6,000, my word doesn't mean anything anymore." Cross was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded.
"Once."
Respectfully. "Your father," he said slowly, "was a wise man." "Yes," Lena whispered. "He was." Edward Cross turned and walked toward the door. But before he left, he stopped and looked back at her. "You're going to do just fine in this world, Lena Moore." And then he was gone. The rain had stopped by the time Lena and her mother left the hotel. Helen hadn't said much. She'd been waiting in the hallway the entire time, pacing, worrying, praying. When Lena finally emerged from the conference room and handed her $600 bills, Helen had started crying. Not sad crying. The kind of crying that comes when something impossible becomes real. They walked home together through the wet streets, the city lights reflecting in the puddles, the air cool and clean. "You really turned down $6,000? Helen asked quietly. "I did." "Why?"
Lena thought about it.
About her father. About the radio. About all the nights spent learning languages she never thought she'd use. "Because Dad taught me that who you are matters more than what you have." Helen stopped walking. She turned to Lena, pulled her close, and hugged her so tightly that Lena could barely breathe. "I'm so proud of you," Helen whispered. So proud." They paid the rent the next morning. $600.
Exactly.
Their landlord took the cash, counted it, and nodded. No apology for the threats. No acknowledgement of the fear. Just business. But Lena didn't need an apology. She had something better. That night, she sat in the living room with the old radio on her lap. She turned the dial slowly, listening to the crackle of static, the distant voices in languages most people would never understand. And somewhere in the static, she could almost hear him, her father, telling her what he'd always told her. "Know your worth, Lena. And never let anyone take it from you." She smiled. Because tonight, she hadn't just spoken his language. She'd lived his lesson. Months later, Edward Cross sat in his office on the 63rd floor of a glass tower, looking out over the city. He'd closed a dozen deals since that night, made millions more, expanded into 3 new markets. But he kept thinking about the girl. The one who turned down his money. The one who knew something he'd spent his whole life forgetting. That worth isn't given. It's claimed. And no amount of money, no empire, no power, no control, could ever buy what that little girl had walked into a room full of billionaires and taken for herself.
Dignity.
He didn't write her a check. Didn't offer her a scholarship or a job or a press release. Because he understood, finally, that she didn't need his help. She never had. Lena Moore went back to school. She kept learning languages. She kept listening to the radio. And every time someone asked her what she wanted to be when she grew up, she gave the same answer. Someone who knows what they're worth. Not rich. Not famous. Not powerful. Just someone who knew that the price you name for yourself is the only price that matters. And no one, no matter how much money they have, no matter how loud they laugh, no matter how small they try to make you feel, can ever take that away. Because worth isn't something you earn. It's something you carry. And Lena Moore? She'd been carrying it all along.